I have spent a lot of time trying to figure out how to write about and discuss Act 4 of Homestuck. Still don't have any clue how to, really. This is a section of Homestuck that I was kind of dreading. Significantly dreading, actually. Falling between my beloved intermission and Act 5, Act 1, two of my favorite parts of the story, I was already kind of expecting a bit of a dip in my enjoyment of it, to be honest. Which is fine. Part of completing something that you really want to accomplish is pushing through the parts that are less enjoyable. What I didn't expect was just how adrift it would actually have me. So, full disclosure. I had already finished rereading Act 4, written a script, and recorded the entire thing, and was well underway with editing it within a few months of finishing the last video. And then, while editing it, I kept getting blocked up, and eventually was forced to confront why I just couldn't make myself finish working on the video. I hated it. I hated how it sounded, I hated the words I was saying, I felt completely disconnected from what I was seeing on the screen. And it was just a whole horrible thing. I've read somewhere before that if you're getting stuck in a creative process, the problem is actually usually a few decisions back. And for me, that was with the theme of the video. And since I didn't really have a new theme, eventually I just decided to go ahead and pretty much reread Act 4, take notes again, and start over from the beginning. Guys, Act 4 is a rough one for me. I'm very ambivalent about it, generally speaking, and a friend of mine thought it might be a good idea to explore why it's left that impression. And I always think that kind of thing is a good place to start, so we're gonna unpack the wonderful, insurmountable landmark that is Homestuck Act 4. But first, I thought it might be a good idea for a quick check-in with Jade Quest. Despite Act 4 feeling very Jade-centric to me in a way that's hard to explain, I don't really think there's any weight to the idea that she's more centered here than anyone else is, I still would say that I'm not personally invested in her just quite yet. This YouTube series mini journey is pretty much my main motivation for paying her any real attention right now. That said, I do think I'm noticing a bit more about her than I was previously. It doesn't equate to depth quite yet, but there are hints of secondary traits that aren't quite what she puts out on the surface, which is enough to get started. For one, I've realized something very important about my own relationship to Jade, which is that, like most happy-go-lucky sweet girl characters, I like her the most when she's being a little bit mean. Don't get me wrong, it's important that she's generally very nice, but there's something about just that little bit of bite coming out that really keeps me on board with the idea that, like, nice characters aren't too good for their environment or whatever. One instance that maybe really highlights how much I've nice girlified her, because this isn't really mean and shouldn't have surprised me this much, is this one interaction that she has with Dave, where she is acting as his server player, and while she's deploying stuff, she has the thought, this whole place is a disorganized mess. It kind of reminds you of your room, but full of weird and ironic stuff instead of cute and great stuff. Your stuff is so much better. And I wrote this in my notes with, in all caps, judgmental? I mean, to be fair, she's not wrong. Her living space is easily the best one of the four, and Dave's is easily the most disturbing environment, but that kind of just makes it better. There's not a lot of little things like this early on in the comic, but I've got my eyes peeled for it going forward. I'll be honest, on my quest to loving Jade, I am not quite there yet, but if she's got enough of a mean streak, that could be a lock. Further review needed. Actually, her interactions with Dave do generally feel seated with a lot more actual personality than her interactions with the others, so that's something to make a note of as well. Really, I am also starting to wonder if it's possible that there's actually a lot coming down the line about her, and that I've just kind of forgotten it in hindsight with some of my later, stronger fixations in the comic. I guess we'll try to find out. In the meantime, the attempt is at least kind of pushing her into my spotlight a little bit. Good luck surviving there. That's about all we've got right now, so now we can get back to talking about Act 4, another thing I have had to try my best to love. Let's flash back to my childhood for a second, because I do think that Acts 1, 4, and 5 contain some of the scenes that I remember most vividly gripping me when I read them the first time. What was Act 4 to me when I was 11 years old? Well, what was the rest of the comic to me? I knew there was a grander story happening, but for the most part, I was kind of just following the moment to moment reactions of the characters, which is not always easy to do in a group where half of the characters are always putting on the happy go lucky face and the other half are always putting on the insincere one. So I think it was mostly just me having fun. Not a bad thing, but only sometimes the kind of engagement that I'm interested in now, and definitely not what this series is focused on. When I try to engage with Act 4 more intellectually, what is in my way? For one, while I'm reading it, I feel that it has a lot of really good content from moment to moment, but it didn't feel like it had very much claim to its own identity. I think in retrospect, maybe this is partly because it's just so much longer than the rest of the story so far. In trying to tie it all together, it didn't really feel like any of this added up to parts of a whole. This is a sharp contrast to Act 5, Act 1, which I kind of see as the most cohesive part of the story, for obvious reasons. I finished rereading it for this video the first time and looked back on it, and it felt like a slog. But in going back through it, I realized it's not a slog at all. The truth is, Act 4 is an incredibly fun act to read, it's just a chore to try to think about as a full concept. It only feels like a slog in retrospect. Now, when I was talking to friends about this leading up to rereading the whole act, one of them suggested something that I understood but didn't think was necessarily the problem. Basically, the idea was that it had to do with the number of things that are being set up in this act. Like the number of things being put out there without any immediate payoff would somehow be something of a drag. But while this got me thinking, it isn't really a problem for me to sit with the setup of things I've already seen before, because I really like identifying the starting points of things. And with Homestuck, there's a lot of major lore components and, story progression that I never really understand perfectly. So it's kind of a fun intellectual exercise for me to try to do that. So I don't have a problem with setup. So what's the problem here? And while going back through it again, taking my notes and copying huge chunks of lore conversations, I realized the problem is that I'm looking for something that isn't set up. I was looking for a core identity to wrap Act 4 up in a nice little bow with, some center point that I could talk about. And I wasn't finding it. Because Act 4 has no self-contained identity. It's not Act 5, Act 1. There's not really anything in particular that it's about, because Act 4 gets its core strength from the section of the overall story that it is. The problem is that Act 4's core identity is set up. I very much look at stories as having chapters that are easily defined on their own, in addition to being parts of a whole. But this isn't like that. And once I realized that and started to just let it kind of be what it is, I actually had a lot of fun looking at the various techniques that were used to start to kind of give the whole comic its identity. Act 4 is in some ways the beginning of the real story. Not because everything that we've seen so far hasn't been important, but because a lot of what people really love to talk about has its roots planted right here. It is the groundwork of everything that you're expected to pay attention to for the rest of the story. We start to get information on elements of the game itself, which, while less important to me, is definitely something that needs to be covered before shit starts getting catastrophic later on. There's a good amount of story set up too, discussions of how characters got to this point, establishing some connections and dynamics, foreshadowing of plot points that have apparently already come to pass. It's sort of a checkpoint. If you can relatively follow what's going on here, then you're prepared to scaffold on it. And if you're not, now's your chance to figure it out. They even give you 2 recaps in case you have just, completely been confused or missed huge elements. I always read them because I always have. And then, maybe less recognized but definitely important to story discussion, this act is where I would argue the thematic elements of the story are first brought into conversation. In fact, the same few scenes are particularly important to both of these aspects. But unfortunately, I'll need to start by talking about the lore proper. Let me be super clear, I am not a world-building person. Even when I care about a fictional world, I generally don't care about the broader, minute details of it. I care about people, and that's always going to be my main focus, whether that's in characters or themes. Sometimes I can like a fictional world's vibes, but if the vibes take a back seat to the technical information, I'm gonna struggle with every single word you just told me. It just doesn't feel relevant. I think Homestuck manages to somewhat bypass this issue because we do learn a lot of the game's functions from where characters are interacting directly with it, which is helpful. But that doesn't stop it from being a lot of huge lore dumps at once, which is hard for me. But on rereads, it's a lot easier because of how much you know from just long-term exposure to it. So, how much heavy lifting does Act 4 actually do for the plot? First off, I want to say that the trolls are actually a much better means of conveying this information than I used to give them credit for. Obviously, they've already played the game, so they have information that we as the audience lack. Now, the problem with this sort of method would ordinarily be that if you have characters on board who already have all the information, you risk giving your audience too much too fast, and then you kind of lose your ability to play your hands over time. I'm not sure how much Hussey thought of the specific moments information was going to be revealed in while they were writing this, but it definitely helps to have wiggle room for key reveals anyway, especially spaced out over a longer story like this. The other issue with having characters that are more up to speed is that in addition to losing your ability to skillfully deploy reveals, you also run the risk of having your audience read basically an entire encyclopedia at once, or having it come across as extremely weird that the characters don't do that. For all Homestuck is known for its big lore dumps, I would say it actually handles the pacing of these pretty well. The amount of details to understand makes sense for a story of this length, although for something shorter, I would say it's ridiculously indulgent. And it solves these potential issues with the trolls in just about the simplest, possibly most effective way one can, by just giving the knowledgeable characters reason to avoid sharing things. Generally, it's a lot of antagonism with them, or aggravation at having to repeat things at different points on the timeline, or they just don't see a reason to give information that they think won't change what's already happened. Frustrating for the audience, very frustrating for the main cast, but also a great use of bait. And I think that type of thing is only a problem if it lacks appropriate follow-through. And I happen to know it does not. Terezi early on talks to Rose on her planet about the role of seers. More importantly, she also talks to her about the role of the exiles, which we've been seeing but haven't really understood as a built-in mechanism yet. The fact that their role is designated from the start is an important thing to understand because the game's NPCs are critical to getting what goes wrong in the game later on. Especially since we learn explicitly that a lot of their role is completing time loops and guaranteeing necessary events. This kind of directs our attention to it before we actually see a lot of it play out throughout the course of the act. Particularly the movement of the Queen's almost fully prototyped ring. That said, even while explaining this, even Terezi gets tired of trying to break the whole thing down and ends the conversation. We get our other piece to this puzzle way later when Karkat is messaging John in the ectobiology lab and finally lets him in on the fact that it is Jack Noir specifically that demolishes the kid's whole session. We still don't fully know why, but we've seen a lot of what contributes play out at this point, and my god, we've even seen pretty much all of the key elements happen on screen. A certain genetic code, anyone? It's actually so scary to realize that at this point in the story, you could very well have all the pieces you need to actually predict where this is gonna go. The ectobiology time loop explanation is also given during that same conversation, and that's pretty important because if you don't know how that works, then you can't understand the scratch later on, and if you don't understand the scratch, then pretty much every character behavior and plot point in the future becomes meaningless, and that kind of just ruins everything. So definitely an important thing to start to grasp now before we add more layers onto it. There are some smaller things in this too, like vague mentions of the planet's quests for the kids, but we still don't know much about those at all, and maybe we never will. And since we just spoke of the scratch, we also get a fun early mention of Jake's existence over here as well, but fuck me if I remember how he and Jade are in contact yet. Point is, an absolutely critical amount of lore, and honestly, I think it's deployed pretty masterfully. Now we get to talk about what I actually like to focus on. The first few acts of Homestuck are incredibly character-centric more than anything else. We don't really know much about what the world or game is going to be like yet, we have to take a lot of things at face value, and we have no idea in the long run what the story is going to be trying to say. So we spend a lot of time pretty much just reading people talking to each other. So it's a good thing that the dialogue is fresh and very delightful, or it would be very hard to get sucked into this. Like I said in video 1, this is written in a way that feels very relatable to people, especially neurodivergent people, even when we're not quite sure what we're actually reading about yet. Act 4 is where that all starts to turn around. I've been paying close attention to this while reading even before the topic change because a lot of the themes of Homestuck are things that have always been very important to me, even since I was a child, even if it put new words and concepts to them. And of course there's a chicken and egg situation to it, because I feel like once Homestuck brought these things up, a lot of us couldn't avoid noticing where it came up in other works down the line. Before Act 4 begins, there's virtually no real exploration of the themes that haunt a lot of people about the comic. And then, all at once, the story suddenly seems to figure out exactly what it needs to be thinking about. Multiple things it needs to be thinking about, actually. Let's go back and look at some of those technical moments through a different lens. During the lore dump I mentioned earlier, when Terezi is explaining the exiles to Rose, she brings up that they both have the job of guiding the player's actions and completing stable loops in the timeline. This act actually makes Terezi the first person to broach the subject of whether the timeline can be changed, which in my mind introduces the various ways that Homestuck is going to deal with the free will question. Because despite the importance of the stable time loops, she goes on to be the one to tell John that she has an interest in experimenting with the timeline and seeing if it can be messed with. She's the first one to actually ask if the events of the comic that we've seen play out so far are set in stone. I don't know exactly how much this was planned, but using her specifically to do this is really powerful, because if anyone in Homestuck grapples with the enormity of choices, it's her. And I'll probably talk about this later, but thinking back on it, she may be the strongest argument in favor of free will in Homestuck. And at this point in the story, we as the readers are not really sure what to make of this question either. Even as a kid, while I was obviously firmly on the side of free will in general, I had no way of knowing what this story was actually going to have to say about it in the long run. Actually, I'm kind of glad that I had to stop reading and re-involve myself years later, because I think that what it has to say might have been a bit beyond me at that time. It's also a bit of an interesting note because while Terezi messing with John and getting him killed by his denizen does change both the offshoot timeline and the one he survives in, Dave Sprite points out that by doing this, she's basically complicit in making the timeline go the way that it did, and therefore creating the situation that the trolls are now looking back on and lamenting. Which maybe also introduces the idea that in Homestuck, the only true way to break something is to try to fix it. On the note of the exiles, while it was never really spelled out for us while they were on screen, this does kind of give them a nice little through line back to Act 1. Obviously, the presence of them and the back and forth between past and future did already kind of tug at the idea of whether or not these things were set in stone, but we didn't really have cause to think too much about it until it was spelled out for us. That said, they in themselves are also a great tool for establishing this, because we see kind of the same type of thing play out with them that we saw with Terezi's ploy. On the one hand, the exiles are given a very particular kind of storyline. They have a set role within the confines of the game. They're NPCs set on different sides of a war, and they all have different jobs within their kingdoms. And while the kids are out running around and pretty much barely noticing them, each of them makes key decisions that kind of fly in the face of who they're supposed to be. And yet the consequences of each of these decisions is ultimately what gets them exiled from their kingdoms, netting them the most important role in the game as the kids' guides. It sort of follows this continued contradiction, where the free will of the characters is really the most important thing, because it is ultimately what ensures that they follow a particular script. They make really certain that you at least get introduced to how significant choice still is, even as you're getting the predetermined story in reverse, because that's the only real way to keep you invested in individual decisions and moments, when you keep getting the message that they may not actually change anything. During the conversation where Karkat explains Jack Noir and ectobiology, he also goes ahead and spells out the free will question in more detail, although he's obviously more embittered by the whole thing. To me, this is to the themes what the recaps are to the story elements. He gives the lowdown on the ultimate riddle, but his tone kind of makes it seem as though he thinks of it as pretty much just a cruel joke. And he's a great choice for this spiel because you kind of get the sense that it's creating himself and their ancestors that ultimately kind of seeds the idea for him that the game may be saying something about how much they can actually affect the outcome. What all these boil down to is some grander statement about what you see happening here. That you were always the key to seeding your own existence through this game. And any hope that it could have played out differently or that you could have avoided this whole mess was always just a ruse. Because if it didn't go down this way, then how were you even born, get it? The Jack Noir component of this conversation is also thematically critical. This is where we finally figure out what it is that goes so wrong that they supposedly can't change, although we have no idea why yet, and this is the kind of thing that will continue throughout the course of the story. We know what the undesirable outcome is, and we can even know what outcome would be better, but without the steps to get there, there really isn't an ability to do anything about it. Even at the best of times, the characters are forced to make decisions with only partial knowledge, and I feel like that's a really important thing to establish here and now. At this point in the story, maybe the characters can change things and maybe they can't, but the hope for doing so lies in the very thing that they don't have right now. Answers. Answers that we'll be spending the rest of the comic getting. And tied into all of this free will conversation is the other major theme that Homestuck fans have never been able to stop agonizing over. Its ideas of consciousness, identity, and selfhood. Homestuck is very obsessed with the idea of the self. Down the line, it's going to come up virtually every 20 seconds. You may think that you've seen media explore this topic. If you haven't read Homestuck, you haven't yet. While I don't always agree with what it seems to be positing every single time, I very much look forward to exploring how my thoughts and feelings have and haven't changed on this as we continue. I think that in a lot of ways, I'm a lot more empathetic than I used to be, and I've also had my fair share of experiences that make me think that some of this is going to hit a lot harder this time around, and God do they do a good job bringing it out in this act. In my original script, I had isolated out a specific moment to talk about, and I think it says something that I can't avoid bringing it up even with the subject change. The doomed timeline Dave and Rose conversation might be one of the most ruminative moments in the comic. Following a series of pretty light conversations, it feels like a pretty abrupt shift tonally. The panels feel darker to me somehow, and it doesn't hurt that the conversation is between two of our more deadpan characters in the comic, or that we learn very casually here that the reason it's between these two characters is because our lighter characters are dead well before we're really used to processing death in Homestuck. But during this conversation, Rose posits the question of what happens when Dave goes back in time to fix things, and whether it'll make her cease to exist. Then she follows that with questioning if the timeline might continue to exist with her on her own within it. This is a lot for early Homestuck, and I think the long-term exposure to these ideas can kind of make you forget that when you're not progressing through it from the beginning. These are pretty horrific ideas of what can happen to a person's consciousness, and it's exacerbated by the fact that Rose, of all people, is expressing such clear anxiety about it. Dave suggests that she go to sleep to try to preserve her consciousness through her dream self, leading Rose to give what is one of my favorite broader quotes in the comic that I think summarizes all of this really well. I think the true purpose of this game is to see how many qualifiers we can get to precede the word self and still understand what we're talking about. Let me know how I'm doing with that, by the way, because this stuff is actually really hard to write. The plan ultimately seems to lead to some weird merging of her memories of the two timelines, though she claims to only have vague memories of the doomed one now in the new timeline. In preserving the Rose from the original timeline, the main timeline Rose is changed, clearly, and I think her tone really reflects that, though she's only really open about any of this with the Dave that she actually went through this stuff with. Speaking of him, He's the one that I actually really wanted to bring up in regards to all this, because he is the first one to give us the full weight of the concept of alt selves. He is the first character to exist and deal with the gravity of existing in a world where there are multiple active versions of you. Dave Sprite is the first alt self to experience a microaggression. Or macroaggression, probably. While he's explaining the game's gate mechanics to John, and it's always the lore dumpers who get bashed in this comic, he gets hit with, "Hey, no offense, but do you think I could talk to the real Dave for a second?" And while it doesn't get lingered on for very long, since it's Dave, he does get very blatantly aggravated about this in a way that is atypical of him. Even John is kind of surprised by the tone shift. And this establishes a lot as far as people's relationships to alternate versions of each other, kind of begging the question, what is it about a person that actually makes us feel the way we do about them? And also wondering how it might feel to be looked at as lesser for being me but different. As far as the idea of the self goes, this is the only set of instances that we get right now, but to my memory, it actually gets brought up even more than the former as the comic goes on. So it's really important that we establish this as its own standout moment right now, so that we never really shake the heaviness of that. Way less important to me yet, but also very important to the comic's identity, we get the first of our author self-inserts here, which kind of starts us on the journey of figuring out how relevant the story concept is to what events are allowed to take place, and what happens to a story as it progresses out of the hands of its author. But if I even bother unpacking all of that, that'll be at a much later date. So what's the one grand takeaway from Homestuck Act 4? Well, for one, that I really need to stop trying to impose my own structures onto things that don't fit it. I'm not usually a miss the forest for the trees kind of girl. Usually it's the opposite, actually. But sometimes taking things in small chunks like this can still cause you to do that anyway. Maybe the fact that the story is so long is not an excuse to be breaking it into these bite-sized pieces. Maybe if I'm struggling to care about a given segment of something, I should be paying more attention to what role it serves in the overall project, and trying to take the large and small in at the same time. Maybe I should be doing the same with my own creative projects. My less personal takeaway is that Act 4, and to a wider extent Homestuck, is actually incredibly effective at directing attention and understanding to the right places. Despite a lot of naysayers about the lengths of certain exposition or the way that screen time is spent, I would say the fact that people are able to have cognizant discussions about most aspects of the story, despite the clusterfuck, is probably a testament to talent. But the key is, it's talented at doing this for certain people. I feel like Act 4 is proof of the concept that Homestuck is not given to us on a silver platter. It can be easy to understand with everything that is given to us, but in return, it is asking you to invest in it. And it is telling you all of this under the assumption that you have already decided to do so by being here, not to try to convince you to. It's written for people who have found this thing and thought, yes, I see myself here, and actively want to love it. Sometimes that means having a bit of patience, accepting difficulty, and being willing to actively engage with things that seem less catered to you because you respect it enough to do that. I am very much looking forward to getting into Act 5, Act 1. But I'm also very glad that I sort of accidentally discovered a real love for Act 4 and for talking about Act 4 while I was working on this. I'm glad I was willing to take the time to start over and rethink everything so that I could do that. And I'm glad that, like Hussey creating this specifically for enthusiasts, I didn't settle for less than I could be proud of. To that end, let this mark a commitment to a ridiculously individualistic approach to talking about this comic. This is my then and now, and frankly, I should probably be spending a lot more time talking about my personal experiences relating to it and the process of trying to analyze this. You've been warned. Thank you so much for listening. Despite the upload schedule, I cannot express enough how important this series has suddenly become to me. And I have made the important decision that my only real goal is that I finish this series by April 13th, 2030. That's 7 years later. We like to keep our numbers significant around here. If I finish earlier, I finish earlier. But that's the ideal. So, buckle up. We're gonna be here a while.